War. It's one of the most devastating things we do. And we all hear the usual reasons for it, right? It's about land or politics or resources. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the real war, the one where it all begins, is fought on a hidden battlefield inside our own minds? Today, we're going deep into the psychology of human conflict.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look past the obvious headlines. Then we'll dive into how our brains are literally wired for us versus them. We'll see how stories can turn a nation towards conflict and get inside the minds of the leaders making the calls. Then we'll tackle a tough one, how violence actually becomes possible. And finally, we'll flip it around and ask if psychology holds the keys to peace.
All right, let's get into it. Section 1, Beyond the Headlines. We think we know why wars start, but honestly, the standard explanations, they just don't tell the whole story. The real triggers are often invisible. They're psychological.
So I want you to really think about this for a second. Forget the news reports, forget the history books. At the most fundamental level, what makes us, as human beings, organize ourselves to kill each other on a massive scale?
And look, these are the usual suspects, right? We're told it's about fighting over a piece of land, a political disagreement, a scramble for oil, or some clash of big ideas. And yeah, those things are definitely part of the equation, but they're more like the setting for the drama, not the drama itself.
Because here's the core idea we're exploring today. War isn't some external force that just happens to us. It's something that comes from us. It is a product of our psychology, our identities, our fears, and the way we see the world.
Which brings us to Section 2, the us versus them brain. To really get a handle on war, we have to start by understanding ourselves and some of the very old, very deep-seated instincts we all share. So, let's talk about something called social identity theory. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. A big part of who you think you are comes from the groups you belong to. Your country, your city, your favorite sports team. It gives us a sense of belonging, a shot of self-esteem, which is great. But there's a flip side. It automatically slices the world into us and them. And you can really see that deep psychological split laid out here. For our own group, us, we feel things like loyalty, belonging, and safety. We have empathy for them. But for the outgroup, for them, those feelings can get inverted. They're not part of us, they're outsiders, maybe even rivals. And that feeling of safety can turn into a feeling of threat. Our empathy just dials way down. Now you throw fear into that us versus them mix and things get really potent. Fear is maybe the most powerful, ancient motivator we have. It's a survival switch. So when a leader can successfully frame another group not just as different, but as a genuine threat to our very existence, that switch gets flipped. Our primal defensive instincts take over, and suddenly, violence can start to seem like a perfectly logical option.
Okay, so we have these raw materials, our need for identity, our capacity for fear, but how do you shape those feelings into a force that can actually drive a nation to war? Well, that leads us right to Section 3, the narrative of conflict. It's all about the power of a good story.
You know, when leaders want to go to war, there's often a pretty clear psychological playbook they follow. First, you have to clearly define the enemy, make it simple. Second, you have to tell a story about how they have wronged us. It's about framing an injustice. Third, you boil that story down to its simplest form, good versus evil, right versus wrong. And finally, you take all that anger and emotion you've stirred up and you channel it into a call for action.
And that feeling of injustice is absolutely critical. When a group of people feels like they've been humiliated or cheated or oppressed, it creates this incredibly powerful simmering anger. A smart leader can tap right into that. They can frame a war not as an act of aggression, but as a quest for justice or a way to restore national pride. It becomes a story of righteous revenge.
And of course, that national anger is a powerful tool for the people at the top. So that brings us to Section 4. Let's zoom in on the psychology of the leaders and governments who actually make the decision to go to war, because their minds matter a lot.
You might think the quest for power is all about cold, hard strategy, but it's often way more personal, more psychological than that. For a leader, winning a war can mean cementing their place in history. It can boost their status, make them look strong, and make them incredibly popular back home. War can be a tempting tool for building a legacy.
This all leads to a classic trap in international relations, one that's built entirely on misperception. It's called the security dilemma. Let me walk you through it. So you have it Nation A. They're feeling a little nervous, a little vulnerable. So they start building up their army. From their point of view, it's completely logical.
This is just for defense. It's about keeping their people safe.
But now, put yourself in Nation B's shoes. You look over the border and you see Nation A building tanks and training soldiers. You don't see defense. You see a threat. You see them preparing to attack you. So what do? You start building up your military to match them. And on it goes. That's the security dilemma. It's this tragic spiral of fear where two countries who just want to be safe end up making war more likely.
And what makes that spiral even more dangerous is something called the optimism bias. History is just littered with leaders who are absolutely convinced that a war would be quick, easy, and over by Christmas. They consistently overestimate their own side's abilities and underestimate their enemies. This kind of dangerous overconfidence makes the enormous gamble of starting a war seem like a much safer bet than it really is.
Okay, this brings us to Section 5, and this part can be tough, but it's essential. How do you go from high-level decisions and national anger to ordinary people actually committing acts of violence? How does that become possible? It turns out there are two really powerful psychological mechanisms at play.
The first one is a chilling process called dehumanization. Before you can get people to harm others, you often have to convince them that the enemy isn't really human at all. You paint them as monsters, as animals, as vermin, as a disease. This basically works like a switch that turns off our natural empathy. It creates a kind of moral loophole that makes violence feel not just possible, but justified.
And you can see it, you can hear it in the language of propaganda. The enemy is never a person just like you with a family. No, they are a monster. They are an evil force. They aren't just an opponent, they are something that must be destroyed. Once that idea takes hold, the moral barriers to violence just begin to dissolve.
The second piece of this puzzle is, frankly, obedience. Famous psychological experiments have shown, again and again, that most of us are far more likely to follow orders from an authority figure than we'd like to believe, even when those orders involve hurting someone. Now, imagine that tendency in the rigid, top-down structure of a military. Most soldiers aren't fighting out of pure hatred. They're fighting because they are following orders. It's what they've been trained to do.
So I know, after all that, it is really easy to feel pretty pessimistic about human nature. But here's the crucial thing. Psychology doesn't just give us a diagnosis for war, it also points us toward a cure. This brings us to our final section, the mind of peace. If we know the drivers of conflict, we can start to figure out how to reverse them.
And the good news is, for every one of these psychological traps, there's a potential way out. Misinformation and misperception, the antidote is education. The us versus them instinct, we can fight that with cross-cultural communication that builds empathy and rehumanizes the other side. Instead of a spiral of hostility, we can choose diplomacy and negotiation. And maybe most importantly, we need leaders who actively choose to unite rather than divide, backed up by strong institutions that make cooperation the norm.
So we'll end on this thought. War isn't just about tanks and treaties. It's a psychological event. And if the seeds of war are truly planted in our minds, in our biases, in our fears, and in the stories we tell ourselves, then it stands to reason that the seeds of peace have to be planted in that very same place. The ultimate battlefield, it seems, is inside each of us. And so is the power to choose a better path.